the Institute for Latino Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Today is April 5th, 2007, and I'm here with poet Steven Cordova and my friend at the University of Notre Dame. We're in McKenna Hall in the library, and I'm María Melendez, and we're here at the sponsorship of Letras Latinas. Francisco brought us out. Letras Latinas is a program of the Institute of Latino Studies, run by our friend and fellow poet, Francisco Aragon. Thanks for coming out here from New York to do an interview.
You're welcome. The drive here with you was very nice.
That was a lot of fun. We came into Chicago together and had a little road trip. So we're starting with Catholicism.
You're going to start with the little topic.
That's right. Start with the little topics and work up. That's
Okay.
right. And then we'll get to some of the background stuff maybe after this question.
All right.
So as an ex-Catholic, I sometimes wonder how Catholicism influences others of my friends who are ex-Catholics as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how it influences their adult lives or their lives as writers. Your life as a writer, is there?
Well, I'm not sure exactly how strong Catholicism was followed in actually followed in day-to-day life and when you were growing up. But I know, in my family, my grandmother was the most religious. I lived in a family with my grandmother, my mother, and my brother. My grandmother was the most religious, but that only meant that one Sunday she would announce that we hadn't been to church in a while, and so we'd go to church, for a few Sundays, and then slack off again. And she read the Bible a lot, and had a little altar in the house, and she prayed there, and there was religious pictures all over the house. But that was pretty much it.
I see.
So, it wasn't ever really that strong, I think, for me, in any case. I didn't read the Bible and learn the stories as a child myself. But nevertheless, the iconography gets into your head. And so I think to whatever extent it comes across in my adult life and in my writing, it's subconscious. It was just, there were so many pictures of Jesus around the house and grandmother's little altar that it comes out in the poem sometimes.
Well, here's a question about spirituality more broadly then, not necessarily Catholicism. I've noticed spiritual elements in your poems, spiritual resonances, including addresses to the divine, direct addresses to the divine. I think At the Delacorte is the poem that comes to mind as an example there. Contemplation of the afterlife. And I also think some of your love poems and your relationship poems have a spiritual dimension because the two people in them seem like they're part of something bigger and greater than themselves. So that to me seems like a spiritual dimension. So would you, I guess, if you could just talk a little bit about spirituality and poetry, or spirituality more generally, not simply Catholicism in particular, and how it fits into your writing at times.
Well, when you told me you were going to ask me this question, I thought of a poem I have that's a ghazal, and I address God in the last line. But a ghazal is an address to God.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes.
That was part of the form.
So the form kind of brought it on there, although I'm sure that subconsciously
you were drawn to the form, yeah.
And then I think when I mentioned God At the Delacorte, it's kind of the way we say God in conversation, or the way that, we all joke about how if we're in a plane and it's going down, we'll start praying. But I think that you're right, that, subconsciously it's probably coming from, a more serious place, having grown up with it. And then I've also written poems that kind of riffed on stories, biblical persona poems. I didn't appreciate those when I was younger, and supposedly growing up Catholic. As I've gotten older, I've made it a point to read the Old Testament and become familiar with some stories from the New Testament, though I haven't read it, and to read some Gnostic literature as well. And I think that it's the equivalent of other poets reading Greco-Roman myths, and it kind of establishes this ground, this narrative ground, where everybody knows the story. So then you can kind of come in and add some new dimension to an old story. So as I grow older, I'm more and more interested in the Old Testament and the New Testament for the stories, more than for a matter of faith. But I'm sure the faith is there somewhere as well.
Interesting. So you see it as a way to kind of communicate across these metaphoric lines or across these familiar narratives.
Right. And it's world literature, I suppose.
Sure,
so,
absolutely.
So you start taking part in that conversation.
Yeah, right, by responding to them in your writing.
Right.
Yeah. Let's do some of the background stuff so we make sure we're archivally in good shape.
Okay.
You were born in?
San Antonio, Texas.
Okay. And went to school?
I went to a Catholic school. We're back to that topic. Until I was in the 2nd grade, I believe. So, and at which time I begged my mother to send me to public school, which she did. And so I went to public schools in San Antonio, Texas. And for college, I went just an hour away to Austin, Texas, to the University of Texas at Austin. And I was there from 1982 to 1986. I majored in art history with a minor in French that I can't read or speak a word of.
But it hasn't hurt you as a poet.
No.
And you've been living in New York for 20 years?
I moved to New York after I graduated in 1986.
I guess I will say for archival.
So yes, 20 years, exactly.
For 20 years. We have talked in the online interview that's available on the Institute for Latino Studies website. In that interview, we talked a little bit about...
That's a little promo spot.
That's a promo spot. About how New York has been important for you as a poet. I think in that interview you said New York was, in some ways, was your graduate studies in poetry because you could go to a museum any day, you could go to see performing arts events, you could take in the city itself, and plus because of the writing community was its own form of education for you.
Well, it gets to be more and more the writing community as New York becomes more and more expensive. It's hard to go out and take part in cultural events because you need money. But, which, as everybody knows, poets don't have.
Poets don't have.
But no, there is that. But I think more importantly, there's a writing community. As I said, my major in college was art history. I didn't, go to a creative, writing program. Other gay poets in New York City have just mentored me out of a sense of community. And in New York, I've also worked at many community organizations like the Gay Men's Health Crisis and like the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, where I met these people, who went on to mentor me. So it's hard to imagine that I would have started writing if I, hadn't been living in New York in these last 20 years.
Interesting. So it's part of your genesis as a writer even,
yes,
is in New York.
Yes. I mean, it could have happened someplace else, but it's kind of hard to imagine, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It is. You have so many poems about New York and about your life there too. Are there other things about your geographic background, about growing up in San Antonio or living in Austin, that you feel are important to your poetry now? I guess I'm thinking of the essay that you wrote for the Macondo contest, and in that essay you talk about being back in San Antonio and recognizing it as home or the original home, and you talk a little bit about the house where you grew up. But aside from that essay, nothing jumps to mind. Maybe there's a poem about flying home, but I can't think of that many that are actually set in Texas. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that when I first started writing, I tried to write a lot of those poems.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
About, our family and growing up, and a lot about my grandmother. I guess all beginner poets write grandmother poems, right? But
you write good ones, though.
Well, but my grandmother did raise me, and so she was my mother. Worked from 9 to 5, and my grandmother took care of my brother and I. So it was, as I said, a matriarchal family, and my grandmother, was the head of it. So she's in there, she's ingrained. But I would like to go back to writing those poems at some point, but I guess I need more distance on them. As I grow older, I find more memories come, and so I can fill in gaps more. And I think that if I just wait till I'm a more mature writer, they'll be less sentimental.
I see. So you're kind of waiting for the right time.
For the right moment.
Yeah, the right moment. It's interesting that you say you feel like more memories come as time passes, which in a way makes you lucky because many people complain of the opposite. So,
well, we'll see what happens.
That's right. That's right. Is there anything else about your educational background, family background, geographic background that you want to add before we go on to more questions about poetry?
No, let's go back to poetry.
Let's go back to poetry. What are you reading these days? And this might be poetry or prose, fiction. We talked about Lawrence Durrell on the drive from Chicago to here. You read me some great passages. So what are you reading these days that you just love? And the tandem question to that is, are there poets or prose writers that you couldn't write without?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm always reading a novel. Should I admit this, like, on camera? I'm one of those poets that I do read a good deal of poetry. Our friend Francisco Aragon, who arranged this interview, talks about for kind of every poem you write, you should have read 10 at least, you know. And I think I, more or less keep up with that ratio, but I have to make an effort to do it. And I think that's simply because I love fiction so much, and I love reading classic novels so much that I just compulsively go from one to the next. So as you mentioned, right now I'm reading the Alexandria Quartet by Lawrence Durrell, who was a poet first.
I didn't know that.
Yes, thus the rich use of language.
Right, that explains it.
But, and prior, what did I read before that recently? Maybe a D.H. Lawrence novel. So, 20th century classics. So it's kind of hard to pick out one from all those. I kind of love them all, and they all start blending together after a while. But in terms of the poets that I can't live without, I think you had like Desert Island.
Yes, right. That was the sort of other version of the same question, is if you were on a desert island and you could bring, I said 5 books, maybe 3.
Well, I think the thing about poetry is, again, I didn't do, a writing program. I always knew that I wanted to write, but, I didn't want to be another one of those people always going around saying that someday they were going to write a novel. I never imagined that when I started writing that it would be poetry, and that only came about because, again, of people I met, working at community organizations in New York that mentored me. So I always feel like I'm playing catch-up in reading poetry. So I can't really say that, I've read a book of poems that I loved and then gone back to it again and again, because I'm always starting to go on to the next thing. Hopefully at some point I'll back up and reread some things. But I think that in general, voices like, Constantine Cavafis and James Merrill and W.H. Auden are very important to me because there's always an air of restraint and polite address to the reader. Everything is understated and kept very mannered. I sit well with that tone. And I think, it has something to do with growing up gay, which is, I think, the other thing I would say about my background and growing up. For a good deal of my life, I had to be reserved, hold back a little bit, not fully reveal myself. So I think that when I write that way, it makes it easy to pace out what I'm writing.
Interesting.
If you're going to reveal your feelings on the page, don't kind of splatter it out. Just kind of pace it along and do it in a very mannered way that's very respectful to the reader, and kind of just takes them through it slowly.
Well, that is interesting to hear you mention Merrill as a model for that kind of, as you say, sort of. I think of your poetry that has that tone, that sort of tone of restraint, as having a sense of decorum in a way.
Yes, exactly.
And it's interesting to hear you list some models in that mode, and then also for you to say your own, learned behaviors as a child and as a young man are kind of feeding that too. That's interesting that can have a sort of formal influence later in life.
Right. They speak to you. Because of your experience.
Sure. That's interesting. Labels. Which labels do you claim and which do you reject for your own work? Or is it not a big consideration for you as you're writing?
Well, when you go to conferences, it's the big question, and it's what poets and writers sometimes talk about when they get together in shop talk. So I've said some things in those conversations, but I think that ultimately, yes, it's not something I put a lot of thought into. When I'm thinking about writing and when I'm writing. And I don't reject, Latino poet. I don't reject gay poet. And I can't remember what black writer, and whether it was a novelist or a poet, who said, if people say I write black poetry or people say I write, black literature, I don't mind because the black experience is so vast that doesn't begin to put a limit on it in any way. I'm just writing about my black experience. So if people, I enjoy being in anthologies of Latino literature because I feel like I'm adding my Latino experience to it. So I don't feel limited, or that that I'm being presented in one way and can only be seen that way. And the same for if you're gay poet or Latino gay poet.
Well, that
gay
brings
Latino
us.
poet.
Yes, right. That brings us to our next question. Also, a related question about labels. As you mentioned, part of our shop talk, in a way, is Latino poetry. What is it? Who decides what it is? What's the value of using it as a label? When is it useful? When is it restrictive? Although you have just now suggested there's a way to see it as impossible to be restrictive because there are as many Latino poetries as there are Latino poets. So the other and more, right, and more yet to come. So I was thinking about your library at home, your collection of poetry at home, and how you just have stacks and stacks and rows of poetry by contemporary gay poets. And so I wondered about the label gay poetry. As we sometimes discuss the label Latino poetry, do you find it useful in some way as a frame, as a reader, as a writer?
Yes.
Tell me more.
I think, well, for a while I was writing movie reviews for a friend in New York City who has started this website called, here's another promo spot.
Plug it.
Film-forward.com. And he, was sending me, for some reason, to see, gay films with gay content in them, to review them. And I was telling my trainer about it at the gym, and he said, well, you should tell him to send you to some regular movies that you don't want to be boxed in and thought of in a certain way. And I was trying to explain to him that, in a way, we just live in such an information age, and all of world literature is available to us, and it can be overwhelming, to know where to insert yourself and what issues to address. And I feel like, reading every book of poems that comes out by another gay author helps me figure out, where to situate myself. This other poet is talking about this aspect of life and gay life. This other poet's talking about this other, aspect Y of gay life. So I can talk about this other one. So it helps. That made it sound too specific in a way. It doesn't the process isn't that thought out. But it's helpful to situate myself. So it makes me feel like I don't have to address all of world literature when I sit down and write. I can kind of pick one part of it and insert myself.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. It's a way of seeing yourself in relationship to, or sometimes in opposition to, maybe.
Yes,
to
absolutely.
some other contemporary gay writers.
Mm-hmm. There has to be some conflict.
Right, that's right. That's what makes life exciting.
It's got to be about life and death.
That's right. Here's a more general question about poetry. I was thinking about the phrase, a poem is working, or this poem is really working. And I think oftentimes newer writers, and we hope newer writers will be viewing this video one day, wonder about how do you know, how can you tell when a poem is working, when things are really cooking? Of course, Emily Dickinson and her remark about the top of the head coming off, that was her sense of how a poem is working when she's...
There's another famous one about you hear the box click close.
Oh, yes, right. Although those, I think, mean as readers of poetry. So how do you, as a writer of poetry, know when things are going well?
I don't. All the time. Sometimes I do. But you're never sure whether you're fooling yourself, because, I mean, there has been a few poems where, yeah, it more or less comes out right in an early draft, then I have to tweak it, a bit to make it really sharp. But it more or less spills out of me in the right order. The events are described in the right order. It has its beginning, middle, and end, and the parts relate to each other. And I show it to other people, and they say, yeah, you're right, just kind of change this here, change that here, this is ready to go. And then there's other times I think it's, ready to go, and, other people help me see that, no, you got to back up on this one a little bit, and work a little harder, and, either tweak it heavily, by which I mean small changes, or, just really try it a different way. So you never know if you're fooling yourself or not. Sometimes you're right. It is there. It is finished. It is working. And other times it's not. So there'll be times I know it's not as well, and I really go seeking help. But the more I write, the less I have that experience, I guess. So the more you write, confidence comes, I suppose.
Interesting. Though, so you said you still seek the opinions of others, but you find you have a better sense of when something is successful now that you're more experienced. Is that what you're saying? That you can...
About that much.
A little bit better sense of when it's working. But
maybe you should never have more than that.
Maybe, yeah, maybe. Yeah, I think poetry is very humbling. I think it is hard to...
Writing is very humbling.
It is. Well, how about tricks to access...
Are we going to a commercial break?
We're going to a commercial break. Burn a shave. Tricks to access inspiration. Days you want to write, you have time to write, but you might not be in the writing mood. Mm-hmm. What are your tricks to get started?
Pick a form.
Okay.
Say I'm going to write a haiku. That's the easy one, because it's just three lines and a few words, but, or try to write a sonnet, or, just try to write, something in form. Don't be closed-minded to your notes. Often, as I said, I'm always reading a novel, so, if I'm reading on the train and I have a little idea, I go to the back page of the novel and write the idea there. And less when I go back to those little things I wrote, am I likely to think, oh, that was a stupid idea, what was I thinking? I think I just try to stick with the idea for just a little while. And for instance, I went to the foot doctor one day, and I made some observations while I was waiting in the waiting room and being led past a room of people with their shoes off, twinkling their toes. And so I wrote down some notes about it, and came back to them and thought they were silly, and I thought, no, kind of stick with it. And that poem might go somewhere, so don't be so quick to write off the little ideas you have. Something little can turn to something big.
Oh, that's good advice.
And then the other is just to, since we need to go to commercial break soon, right? The other is just always read. often, again, when I'm reading a novel or a book, all my notes are at the end of the novel or at the end of a book of poems. Reading another writer sets off a memory in me, sets off an idea in me. I see some way in which, I can write another version of this poem or another version of this paragraph. Yes, I've had a similar experience. That was universal. It speaks to me. And then just, reading, I would say, is my biggest trick for writing in fallow period.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I want to have you read one or maybe two poems on camera.
Okay.
So I'm going to stealthily go over here and get it. And you have some too, okay. So the book you have there is The Wind Shifts. It's new Latino poetry, edited by our very own friend and sponsor, Francisco Aragon. Is there, I have one in here in your chapbook I'd like you to read. Is there something in there you'd also like to read? Or you want to start with the chapbook? I wanted you to read Two Nocturnes in here.
Oh boy, okay, I'll try. But let me warm up for that one.
Oh, okay, with
a
choice. Okay, all right. What are we going to hear? That's a good compromise.
Sissy Boy.
Oh, good.
This is an early poem.
Do you want to read the version that's in the chapbook, or aren't they slightly different?
It's in my head.
Okay, good.
It's enough in my head.
Okay, good.
Sissy Boy. When they first came, panting, begging at back doors, grandparents laid out scraps of food. Grandchildren stroked a thin flank, a small trembling spine, and they remained, but fattened and multiplied. They took to running in packs that barked and turned the whole block in its sleep. One boy dreams hunger, poison hissing. He rolls off the bed, a breath escapes in a rush across linoleum. His own mother made the call. Whining, baying, they struggled, but they were nothing more than strays, a haze of bristle and fur to be netted, caged. Now the streets lay quiet, no howling or mating. Trampled gardens unfurl, trash cans brim their empties, and mamacitas, they sigh, content without the sound of a wanton dog defending itself in the middle of night, fending off the fickle pack that turns on it, the whimpering of the weak-haunched.
Thank you.
And other more challenging one. Oh, look, my little inscription.
Yes. What's the date on that?
April 27th, 2004.
That's when I met you.
Yes. Seems like longer.
It does seem like longer.
Two Nocturnes. Nothing from him. It's all her. All moans and breaths. No words. And though the bit of sky my window lets me have tonight has no moon, I don't mind being woken. Feel no embarrassment. Jealousy doesn't light the room green. She pauses now and then. They're finally falling, I tell the cats, to sleep now. But there she is again. Moans, breast, the poor suffering springs. Where does she go? Moments we hear nothing from her. Does she travel far? Or merge with him as night and day at dawn? Just this once I don't have to have the answer. I tug the sheets and roll back to sleep. So that was the first section of the poem. And then there's a little asterisk, and here's the second section. A web grows between the pane and the window guard inside my bedroom. Grows because I haven't seen the spider, so it's as though the web sprouts as a flower sprouts. Flower, although the web's not elegant or architectural, ziggurat-like in its progression upward. It's ramshackle, unself-conscious. I ask myself how far I'll let this go.
Well, thank you for reading that. That's one of my favorite poems in the chapbook that you read from, which, to clarify, is Slow Dissolve. You want to flash it for the camera?
Oh, another promo spot?
Yes, another promo spot.
Slow Dissolve.
This was the first, I think, chapbook published by Momotombo Press, which Francisco founded and I work on from time to time. The first chapbook published after Francisco had created a new mission for the press, which was to exclusively focus on emerging Latino poets. So
that's right.
The book that I know is very important to Francisco too. That particular book.
The inaugural.
The inaugural, right?
Yes. And I don't think we said the name of this one.
We did, but let's give
Did
it
we?
another promo
okay, well,
spot.
We'll give it another promo. It's very good, but everybody should see.
24 new meaning has one book or less Latino poets in that one.
And it's called The Wind Shifts, New Latino Poetry, and it's edited by our friend. We said he's our friend 3 times. You'll have no doubt.
Because we're depending on him for food and shelter over the next 3 days.
Francisco Aragon.
Well, could you talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, you certainly don't have to, but if you don't mind, about the process of writing 2 nocturnes? I know often newer writers are curious, how many revisions does one go through? I also find the closing image to be very, I guess the word resonant comes to mind. It has a kind of resonance. I ask myself how far I'll let this go. And then it ends. It sort of ripples out. The ending ripples out from there. Did it have that ending in earlier drafts? Well, let's, if you, or I don't know if you want to see it.
Well, and it's one of those endings that I can't, I guess that there's, one of my early teachers, Scott Hightower, a gay poet, often said, you know, you do have to be attentive in workshop and be open-minded and you know, listen to what other people have to say, you know, about your writing. That's kind of, as much as I hate the sexist term, that's kind of where the men get separated from the boys, or the real women get separated, you know, from the girls. You do have to take feedback from other people, and yet at the same time, he would say, you know, don't let them iron out your quirks, because your quirks are what your quirks make you an individual writer. And the reason I thought of that with this poem is because, you know, if you ask me to say why the last line in that poem is, I ask myself how far I'll let this go, I can't explain it, you know, totally fully. It just kind of flowed when I was writing it, and I don't think anybody did say to me in workshop that last line doesn't, you know, you should cut it. I don't understand it. But it was just one of those cases where it was good, it worked for you. It was just good to go with my instinct and kind of what flowed and what came out. So
that reminds me of how poets talk about trying not to pay too much attention to your poems, which is a paradoxical position to be in, because you pay a lot of attention to them as you're rereading them in revision, but there is a way that the successful poems...
Maybe it just means let it flow the first time.
Let it flow the first time,
and then afterwards clean it up.
I think so, yeah. I think that is a big part of what it means. Do you want to say anything about Sissy Boy, about the occasion for writing it, or the dogs?
Well, I guess that's another poem where I was in a workshop at the Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York City, where I worked at the time. And I remember this, and Scott was running, Scott Hightower, who I just mentioned a moment ago, was running that workshop, and he liked it, and people were helpful, but people were having a hard time helping me, I think. And then I showed it to another one of my early teachers, a poet named Yvette Christianse, who is from South Africa, and who writes poems and novels that are very good. Another promo spot.
That's right.
And she was, sometimes it's a matter with some poems of finding the right reader. She got it right away. She told me what I was trying to do in it, which I didn't quite know myself, because again, I just let it flow, and it was kind of coming from someplace very subconscious, I suppose. And she said, "You're the wanton dog in the middle of the night, fending off the fickle pack, that turns on it. So as, I suppose, as a sissy boy growing up, I identified with that dog you'd hear in the middle of the night, fighting off a pack, and she was also helpful in explaining how it works in a universal way, because there's always some group of people, some group of, in this case, group of dogs that kind of comes into the neighborhood that people start feeling threatened by, after a little while. That was helpful, because it made me realize, okay, so the poem's not just about me, but it has more universal applications as well, I hope.
Absolutely, yeah. That's really great, though, to hear of that, experience at such an important point in your writing of the poem, where you weren't quite sure what it was doing. And it's interesting to hear you say
I wasn't sure what I was saying.
You weren't sure what you were saying or why you were saying it, and she had this insight that really clicked with you.
And then it made revision easier.
Okay, you had something to revise toward.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Huh, that's interesting. And who was that teacher?
Yvette Christianse.
Okay, okay. Well, we have a few more minutes if you want to talk more about your chapbook or about your forthcoming book, Promo Spot, new book coming out from Bilingual Press. Mm-hmm. And what's the title at present? I know it might not end up being the title the press might.
The title is Long Distance.
Long Distance.
And I believe it should be out in approximately 12 to 24 months. Oh, good.
From today, April 5th, 2007. Do you want to say anything about putting the chapbook together or about putting the book together? Here's a question for you. I'll put it in more specific terms than do you want to say anything. The chapbook is very thematically focused. Do you feel like the book is organized around one theme, or do you have 2 or 3 core themes that you're working with?
I think there's 2 or 3 core themes. There's, I hope, enough, early poems, which again tended to be about, growing up in Texas like Sissy Boy.
And early, I just want to stop you and clarify. By early, you mean sort of poems that are about writing. 10 years old? Those poems are about 10 years old?
About
okay.
10 years old, right. And poems that also just address the earlier part of my life.
Okay.
There's not that many of those, but I hope enough of them to give some sense of where I came from. Then, as you pointed out, a lot of poems set in New York. So poems to show, where the speaker, to whatever extent it is, really me, and not, it's me, but it's also me writing, taking on a conceit, to show, where I started and where I am. There's enough poems informed by, I think, elegy and the AIDS crisis to kind of situate it in that time period. And there's love poems, which kind of, go from the beginning of a relationship to the end of a relationship. So there's the where I began, where I am now, or where the speaker began and where the speaker is now, and the love story. So I think those are the 2 big things. And I guess underneath that, the 80s and AIDS and the fact that gay poets were writing a lot of elegy, and my poems aren't all elegy, but there's an elegiac tone.
Now that you've been
setting down of that time so that it's remembered.
Oh, interesting. So in some ways they can serve as elegies for that period,
Yes.
in a way? Huh.
Beyond being,
Beyond being individual
elegies, exactly.
elegies. Huh. That's a lovely idea.
But I hadn't actually really thought about it that much, so thanks for asking me the question. Now I feel like the book has to work on those levels.
That's right. Well, I wonder, since now you have, it's interesting to hear you say, I'll write more about my childhood and my childhood home when I'm a more mature writer, and I feel like I'm catching up in poetry, and here you've been pretty seriously dedicated to it for about 10 years. And I guess it just strikes me as we were talking about feeling humble. It strikes me as a sense of humility, to say, well, it's been 10 years and I'm just starting out.
Well, I mean, some of that is that's the attitude I think, any artist should always have. Whether it's a writer or some other kind of artist. But beyond being teacherly and moralizing in that way, I think that some of it's just practical. I have a 9-to-5 job, so sometimes it feels like my time to write and to read and to hang out with other writers and do shop talk and this video. That my time for this kind of thing is very limited. So I'm sure that if somebody decided to give me a lot of money, so that I don't have to work a 9-to-5 job anymore.
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
You behind the camera,
That's
do you
right.
have money? That I still wouldn't feel caught up, even if I had all day to read and write, and who knows, maybe I might not even read and write all day long. But no matter what the situation, if the situation remains that I go on being a writer who works a 9-to-5 job, or somebody gives me money and I don't have to have a 9-to-5 job, that in the end, the sense that you always have catch up to do can only be good for you.
You see it as a kind of a healthy approach.
Attitude.
Yeah, approach to always being in a position of being a learner. Or beginner's mind, the phrase beginner's mind comes to mind. Well, I think it'd be nice to close with a poem. Is there, so that we can end with your words and your voice, let me say thank you again for coming all the way out here and taking the time to do this interview. And later we'll be celebrating the publication of The Wind Shifts, but Francisco had emphasized that coming out here for these interviews was the main emphasis for this visit. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
For a wonderful visit, a wonderful interview. So I'll let you choose. That's right. Now you get to take the books home. The whole library's worth. Poet's Choice. What would you like to
I'll be
leave us
decisive.
with?
Just go right to the
Okay.
Poets can be decisive.
They can.
No, I just have to find what page it's on. This is another early poem.
Talk amongst yourselves, you at home.
That's right. Early in the sense that I wrote it, I don't know, within my first 2 or 3 years of starting to write poetry in 1995 or so. And an early poem in that it addresses, childhood memories and growing up. And it's for my mom. Pecking orders. Here, 1 rooster and 2 hens leave a trail in sand some truant wind will lift. My eyes, once green and globed as a grape, fade to hazel, flatten to gray. Plucking a handful of fruit, what a cool relief that was in the wavering air of this small town. Sand dripped from my scalp, drizzled from the dry ford of my ear. And when a grape seemed too young to eat, I stood on tiptoe and balanced it high on a refrigerator shelf, sure that Father's twin sisters would eat it. They always did, his sisters. They said Father was handsome, that he never drank his green eyes red, never beat his wife. They said he pushed her around a little, the way their father did their mother, a little. High noon again, and again I rise, waiting for the cloud who would lift me in her dark and purpled arms.